It seems many atheists or non-Christian scholars often note that Christian scholars read the biblical text through theological lenses, which results in their conclusions being clouded by their commitment to the Bible. In other words, if someone is a Christian scholar, they have a commitment to the Bible being literal, reliable, or true. So the conclusions a Christian may have about something, with regards to the biblical text, will always be marred by this presupposition.
There's a lot of very, very good, a lot of good evangelical scholars who do good scholarship. But, because of people's faith commitments, it will necessarily push them in a certain direction to find historical continuity in many of these stories.
What they tend to do is they start with the presumption that the Bible is inerrant. Okay, so that's a starting point. It's certainly not the starting point that I start with, or that other scholars in universities, research universities, or liberal arts colleges start with, but it's where evangelicals start.
Yeah, I think Hoffmeyer does tremendous work, Kenneth Kitchen does tremendous work as Egyptologists, but then when they come into these areas of investigation, I think that their theological commitments color their research.
The implication from non-Christians is that we should always take what Christian scholars say with a grain of salt, because of this commitment to the Bible being true. But is this really a fair assessment? Are Christian scholars more biased than their atheist or non-Christian counterparts? And is there any research in sociology that can shed some light on this? In the book, 5 Views of the Exodus, the scholar Ronald Hendel takes the most liberal position, arguing the Exodus has little historical basis. It was merely a cultural memory that developed into a legend. But he also says, the doctrine of inerrancy, as for instance formulated by the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, limits the kinds of inquiries that evangelicals and Orthodox scholars can pursue. Such boundaries for scholarship make a difference in how one approaches the biblical Exodus. Similarly, in New Testament scholarship, Hale Childs accuses many Christian scholars of working from a theological agenda. The New Quest agenda was to re-establish historical links between Jesus of Nazareth and Christ, in order to avoid docetism and the reduction of Christianity to myth. The motivation for this task was theological and not historical. Maurice Casey says, when some 90% or more of applicants are Protestant Christians, a vast majority of Christian academics is a natural result. The overall result of such bias is to make the description of New Testament studies as an academic field a dubious one. And finally, mythicist Richard Carrier acknowledges his biases, but then goes on to say that Christians are more biased. Believers, by contrast, and their apologists in the scholarly community, cannot say the same. For them, if Jesus didn't exist, then their entire worldview topples. The thing they believe in, and need to believe in, more than anything else in the world, will then be under dire threat. It would be hard to expect them to ever overcome this bias, which makes bias a greater problem for them than for me. They need Jesus to be real, but I don't need Jesus to be a myth. This is a brief survey of a common belief found among, not all, but many non-Christian scholars, which is that Christian scholars are often more biased or constrained by theological commitments, and therefore cannot judge the evidence for and against the Bible properly. However, the real problem here is not what is being said, but what is not being said. Many Christian scholars are ready and willing to admit their biases. But the truth is, all scholars are biased. It is inaccurate to say Christians are more biased, or unfair to note Christians have biases, while not acknowledging you or anyone on your side also has biases that can cloud the way they view evidence. In philosophy of history, philosophers and historians note that every historian has a horizon from which they argue from. In other words, no historian can view the evidence objectively. All have a horizon they look through which colors how they see the world. The reason so many historians can look at the same data and come to vastly different conclusions has a lot to do with their horizons. George Igers said, "Historical scholarship is never value-free, and historians not only hold political ideas that color their writing, but also work within the framework of institutions that affect the ways in which they write history." James Tabor says, "It is impossible to gaze upon facts without interpretation. All historians come to their investigations with selective criteria of judgment, forged by both acknowledged and unrecognized predisposed interests and cultural assumptions. There is no absolutely objective place to stand." In truth, there is no such thing as an historian who is unbiased. Historians are humans, and humans are often limited by presuppositions, cultural constraints, peer pressure, and other factors that color the way they view the data. Mike Licona admits that Christian historians often allow their horizon to muddy their ability to make accurate assessments. But non-Christian historians often do the same, and have certain beliefs that prevent them from considering the evidence objectively, or prevent them from considering alternative explanations. In fact, many non-Christian scholars rule out theistic or non-naturalistic explanations, not from an evaluation of the evidence, but because they presuppose naturalism is already true. Rudolf Bultmann said, "An historical fact which involves a resurrection from the dead is utterly inconceivable." Gerd Ludemann, a priori, wrote out the ascension of Jesus, because there is no such heaven to which Jesus may have been carried. Bruce Chilton, a member of the Jesus Seminar, notes several members of the group vote on ideological lines, rather from an unbiased stance. Burton Mack said, "The quest for the historical Jesus seeks to leapfrog over the wrong-headed myths and rituals of the Christian churches, to land at the beginning, where the pure, clean impulse of an uncontaminated Jesus can rectify and rejuvenate Christian faith." And again, this is only a brief sample of non-Christian scholars that admit metaphysical prejudice against the tenets of Christianity. Often skeptics give the impression they are not even willing to entertain the possibility of Christianity being true, or give us the impression that no evidence could ever be sufficient to suggest something exists beyond the natural. Dale Allison, displaying his integrity, admits this. "It is furthermore evident that some we might think of as having no theological agenda are partly motivated by an animus against traditional Christian doctrine, which is in reality just another sort of theological agenda. The trite truth is that none of us is without philosophical bias or theological interest when we sit down to study Christian origins, so the alleged lack thereof seems a dubious criterion for classifying scholars who quest for Jesus." And later in his book he says, "The nearest we can come to being impartial is to admit we are partial." Being a part of academia and lacking religious motivators doesn't mean one is less biased and can look at the evidence in a more objective manner. Numerous studies, regardless of one's religious background, have found that higher levels of intelligence can cause people to develop a biased blind spot, and so may end up forming beliefs from implicit biases instead of through an unbiased evaluation of the evidence. In one study, it was found that people with higher intelligence or education do not differ from people of lower intelligence or lower education in the likelihood of possessing 6 out of the 7 possible cognitive biases. Only when the researchers looked at something they called cell phone bias, which was accepting that you were more likely to be in an accident if you talked on a cell phone while driving, did those with more cognitive sophistication display less bias than the average person. Researchers have found across multiple studies that people higher in cognitive ability do not at all display lower levels of confirmation bias or other cognitive biases. In fact, despite on average being statistically different than people of lower IQ, high IQ people are ironically more likely to display a biased blind spot, and so are more likely to be unaware of their own biases when compared to the general population. To quote, "More cognitively sophisticated participants showed larger biased blind spots. This somewhat surprising finding extended to 6 of the 7 biases." So merely being educated or more cognitively sophisticated doesn't mean you are less biased than, say, a Christian who doesn't have as much education as you. One can still have underlying faith or anti-faith commitments that color the way they evaluate the available evidence. There is also no evidence that lacking a religion or faith commitments means you are less biased. Studies also find that atheists can be biased, especially against religious beliefs in individuals. A study across 3 European countries from 2017 found that in self-reported measures, atheists scored lower in dogmatism than their religious counterparts. However, when indicators of dogmatism were measured more subtly, atheists and agnostics scored higher than the religious subjects in bias and dogmatism. Another paper from 2020 conducted 3 studies in the US, looking at the attitudes and responses from atheists, agnostics, and spiritual but not religious individuals when they were confronted with Christians and Christian beliefs. They found that those who identify as atheists displayed cold feelings, prejudice, belief superiority, and dogmatism when confronted with Christians and Christian beliefs. Our results show that, among the non-religious, feelings of distrust in Christian moral and intellectual judgment, as well as fear of contamination by Christian views or ideas, motivated prejudice towards Christians above and beyond perceived symbolic and realistic threats. Other studies have found atheists and agnostics can show prejudice and discriminatory attitudes towards their religious counterparts. Surveys have also found there are more atheists and agnostics working in academia than what we find in the general population. But we also see evidence those in academic positions have biases against Christians and can discriminate against them. We already did a video where we covered the evidence that indicates scientists in academia have biases against Christians. But there is some evidence this extends beyond the science department. George Yancey has conducted numerous surveys and studies on what he calls Christianophobia. He has found evangelicals and fundamentalists are the groups that are most likely to face bias from academics. Half of all academics were less willing to hire an applicant after learning they were a conservative Protestant. The hostility from academia tends to be comparable to anti-Muslim hostility in the general public. And those who have more education, are more politically progressive, and lack a religion tend to be the most hostile towards Christianity. Other studies have also found anti-Christian bias in academia, indicating those who work in academia often come to the table with biases before even considering the arguments Christians offer for their worldview. If one is hostile to Christianity, then it can cloud the way they view the research a Christian may present. So it is not true to imply or assert that non-Christian scholars are better apt to study the data, or that it is Christian scholars who are more likely to study through faith commitments or biases. All humans do this, and non-religious scholars in academia are no exception. In fact, researchers note within academia, atheists are often stereotyped as being open-minded and intelligent, whereas Christians are stereotyped as lacking intelligence and being closed-minded. Now, this stereotype is most likely not true, as we discussed in another video, especially when a cross-cultural analysis was conducted and found the link between intelligence and atheism was fickle and weak. Some research has also found that Christians have high levels of emotional intelligence, which some have said is more important to possess than analytical intelligence, as it is often better for interpersonal skills. A limited and small study found Christians are not simple-minded and can have more nuanced patterns of thinking that incorporate multiple perspectives. And a meta-analysis did not find a significant correlation between intrinsic religiosity and being closed-minded. The mean value fell within the non-significant range. Despite this, researchers note these generalized stereotypes exist in academia, and this can contribute to biases against Christians and the research Christians may use to argue for a Christian worldview. If academia fosters an environment that presupposes bias against Christianity, then it seems it could be a contributing factor for academic professionals deconverting or outright rejecting Christian arguments in research. Why would a scholar feel good about promoting research that favors a Christian worldview if academia fosters an environment that promotes bias against Christianity? If someone is biased and hostile towards another group, research shows it can warp their view of reality and prevent them from judging fairly and accurately. In the famous Robbers Cave experiment, two groups of boys were set up as rival camps in competition with one another. The researchers fostered an environment where both groups were hostile and biased towards the other. In one game, the groups were told to compete by collecting beans off the ground. Whoever collected the most won. At the end, they were shown two images of piles of beans and told each pile was the total amount of what each group collected. In reality, the images they were shown had the same number of beans and were not the actual totals that each group collected. But the campers always overestimated the pile assigned to their group and argued they collected more, even though both piles were the same. It appears each group's view of reality had been warped by having to compete with each other and already having biases against the other. The point to take away is that having biases against another group can warp how you view the evidence, and your biases can actually make you view the evidence in a way that will always make your ideological opponents look bad or unfavorable. So if someone claims all Christians are biased and we cannot trust their work, then ironically, that person's own biases against Christianity may cause them to be unable to view the evidence in the most objective way possible. Another problem with claiming Christian scholars work primarily from faith commitments is it gives the impression Christians all have the same faith commitments, and there is no diversity of viewpoints. Christians may agree on core doctrines, but beyond this, there is flexibility in how to interpret biblical passages. It is not the case that all Christian scholars have to think the same way about every biblical issue. Mark Smith is a committed Catholic, but is considered liberal compared to many more conservative Christians, being that he takes a more liberal position on the origins of where Yahweh came from. Michael Heiser doesn't claim Moses wrote all of the Pentateuch, and in fact dates Genesis 1 to 11 to the time period of the Babylonian exile. Trygve Mettinger is also a Christian, but directly says the Eden narrative is a myth. Kenneth Kitchen, Richard Hess, and David Falk all promote the idea many of the numerical values and dates in the Hebrew Bible are not meant to be taken literal, which allows for flexibility in dating biblical events. All of these scholars do not fit the stereotype of a Christian who is bound by dogma to think the entire Bible is literal history and that Moses wrote the Pentateuch exactly 480 to 440 years before Solomon built the temple. New Testament scholars are also not held down to specific ways of reading the New Testament. Mike Licona rejects many harmonization theories when it comes to the Gospels, and argues the authors often employed literary devices that gave them flexibility in how they wrote about Jesus' life and ministry. Douglas Campbell agrees with more liberal scholars that Paul did not write all the epistles attributed to him. Even the very conservative James White doesn't hold to the idea every manuscript of a New Testament document preserved exact wording, and he acknowledges there are textual variants between manuscripts. Christians are not bound to read the Bible in only one way, and there is a lot of variety among Christian scholars on how to interpret certain biblical passages, what a doctrine can mean, or when the Bible is meant to be taken literally. It is erroneous to give the impression Christians have certain faith commitments that force them to read the Bible one specific way and prevent them from being flexible in light of new evidence and research. In truth, when someone dismisses an opposing worldview by focusing on the bias of its promoters, while ignoring that they and their own group are also biased towards their own worldview, they are really shooting themselves in the foot. Because what they are essentially doing is admitting how biased they may be towards the ideology of another group. We are being told by these individuals that we cannot trust anything that comes from the other group, because those people have biases that prevent them from thinking objectively about the data. But this person who says this, or implies this, has essentially dismissed the opposing worldview, because they have assumed it stems from emotions and biases, and presupposes it cannot come from evidence or sincere research. One has dismissed an entire worldview without giving it a fair hearing, or without muddying the water, which implies the person who does this could be biased against that worldview. So when non-Christians claim Christians believe the way they do because of theological commitments that force them to interpret evidence in biased ways, they are implying that they might be biased against Christianity. They are trying to give the impression we should presume the arguments from Christians come from dubious motivations. but in doing so, they muddy the water, so people will think lowly of Christianity before we even hear the evidence Christian scholars present. In other words, to call Christians biased is likely to admit your own biases against Christianity. And sadly, this is often the mentality we see coming out of academia. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying someone is necessarily more biased if they are not religious or a part of academia. All humans tend to be naturally biased towards their own group. Adults, children, and even monkeys tend to have natural negative associations with individuals from other groups. So I absolutely agree Christians are biased towards Christianity and want it to be true. But that doesn't mean their non-Christian counterparts in academia do not have biases that make them want Christianity to be false. Often non-Christian scholars muddy the water with their own biases and interpret evidence in a way that doesn't favor a Christian worldview. As we noted earlier, Christians have often been stereotyped as being closed-minded and anti-intellectual. If this is the mentality that runs through academia, one could have biases where they feel pressured to interpret the data in a way that reinforces the stereotype that Christianity is anti-intellectual and contrary to the truth. Those that have deconverted from Christianity may have biases to not return to Christianity, because after leaving, they have stereotyped it as a belief that stems from emotions and faith commitments. This could potentially create a bias that prevents someone from ever seriously considering Christianity again, because they have told themselves and their audience this worldview comes from emotions, biases, and ignorance. So why would they ever want to associate with such a worldview after they have portrayed it as such? To be brutally honest, I will admit, as an ex-young Earth creationist, I have biases against that worldview, because now I believe it comes from a place of ignorance about science and the nature of reality. I don't want to be associated with such a group because of how negatively it is viewed by our culture. This is a bias I have to work on, and why I try to instead focus on the evidence and the reasons for rejecting young Earth views, and not try to focus on the reasons the promoters may have for holding to it. The worldview should be judged on the evidence itself. And we should all strive to judge worldviews, not on the biases of the promoters, but on if the worldview has explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, is the least ad hoc, and can provide illumination. Obviously, there is going to be disagreement about what constitutes as the least ad hoc, and which is the most plausible. The least ad hoc will be the one with the least amount of assumptions, and plausibility is understood as being able to explain more with less, or noting how other disciplines point in the same direction. For example, a theist will often point out the moral, cosmological, and teleological arguments are three separate areas of inquiry, and all point to a god of some sort, which can make the inference to theism more plausible. An atheist needs to account for these three arguments, often with three different explanations, but may say their worldview is more plausible because it accounts for data in other areas better than theism can. This is where the debate needs to happen, not by going down the road of trying to psychoanalyze your ideological opponents and calling them biased. Again, let me be clear. I'm not disagreeing with scholars when they note Christians have biases. I'm asking for fairness and respect. We are all biased in ideological competition and rooting for our own worldview to be true. Let's be honest with each other, and more importantly, be honest with ourselves about our biases. If we can agree on this, we can start having better conversations and extending charity to one another. So I ask you, can we agree on this?